Shalom. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here with you, live from Alon Shavut Gush Etzion. My name is Aviad Tabory, and I want to thank Rabbi Leitner and the United Synagogue community for inviting me here to share some thoughts about Tu B'Shvat, which hopefully we will be celebrating next week. I say celebrating, although there are not many celebrations that have to do with Tu B'Shvat. Truthfully, Tu B'Shvat is a day in the calendar which we don't really feel. If we compare it to all other Jewish holidays, Tu B'Shvat is no doubt is one of the chagim that is hardly felt, as there are no mitzvot, barely customs that apply to this day. If you recall, some people have a minhag to eat on that day fruit or dry fruit. The reason for dry fruit, of course, was because it was difficult to get fresh fruit from Israel. So people used to have dry fruit from Israel and eat it on Tu B'Shvat, which led to a minhag, a custom, which was probably very much done was influenced by the Kabbalists. The Kabbalists here in Israel, of having a Seder Tu B'Shvat, of having almost a Seder parallel to the night of Pesach, in which they would eat different fruit and say certain words and psukim over the fruit and talk about Eretz Yisrael and its fruit. But for many of us, Tu B'Shvat is a day in which we don't say Tachanun in Shul. We don't really feel it. However, my question is, why, out of all the different days that are not real Jewish holidays, how did Tu B'Shvat turn into some kind of holiday? Let's go to the source of Tu B'Shvat. The Mishnah, in fact, the first Mishnah of Masechet Rosh Hashanah mentions that there are 4 Rosh Hashanahs, Arba'a Rashi Shanimim. There are 4 beginnings of a year in the Jewish calendar. We all know the Rosh Hashanah of Echad B'Tishrei. Rosh Hashanah is celebrated on the first day of the year, which is the first day of Tishrei. However, the Mishnah mentions that there are other beginnings of years. For example, Be'echad Be'elul, Rosh Hashanah Le'Ma'asar Behema. The first day of Elul is Rosh Chodesh, is a Rosh Hashanah for the purpose of giving part of your animals to the Beit HaMikdash, to the Kohen. Every 10th animal in ancient times would have to be given to the Kohen. How do you know which animals we're talking about? Every year you have to take a 10th of the animals of that given year. What's the date that cuts the year? Aleph Elul. Now, I don't know of anyone that on Aleph Elul has a minhag of eating meat and celebrating the beginning of the year of Ma'asar Behema. I don't know people that don't say Tachanun. I mean, you don't say Tachanun because it's Rosh Chodesh, but no one celebrates the fact that it's the beginning of the year for Ma'asar Behema. In England, I just looked into this. In England, the school year, deciding which age groups will go into grade 1, year 1, and which will not, is decided apparently by the 1st of March. Right? The Mishnah could have said the Rosh Hashanah for school year, Echad B'Merz, the 1st of March, or the tax date. What's the day that we decide all taxes of this year have to be paid for last year and for the coming year is somewhere in April. That's a Rosh Hashanah. That's a date. It's a very technical matter that basically says certain rules apply up till this date, and from this date we count another year. Tu B'Shvat, says the Mishnah, all it is the cutting date for fruit that blossomed up to Tu B'Shvat and from Tu B'Shvat. All the fruit in Eretz Yisrael that blossomed before Tu B'Shvat are counted in the past year. And everything blossomed after Tu B'Shvat is continued to be part of the next year. For what purpose? Why do I care what year a fruit blossoms? The answer is Trumot u'Ma'asrot, for Shemitah purposes, and Trumot u'Ma'asrot. When I pick apples from a tree in Eretz Yisrael, we have to give some of them to the Kohen. Depends upon which year I might have to give to the Levi, to the poor man, to Maser Sheni. There are different rules and laws that depend upon what year of the 7-year cycle of Shemitah it is. Depending upon that, I have to give that to a poor man or a tunitively take it to Yerushalayim, Maser Sheni, eat in Yerushalayim. How do I decide if it's the first year, the second year, the third year of Shemitah? Tu B'Shvat. Tu B'Shvat is the cutting date, which I decide what is the first year of the 7-year cycle, second, third, fourth, etc. So it's a technical matter. If it's a technical matter, why do Jews throughout the centuries somehow celebrate Tu B'Shvat and somehow feel that Tu B'Shvat is a special date? Now, some might be cynical and say, well, Shvat is a bit of a dead month, not much is going around, so we have a day we can celebrate. However, I think the answer is a profound one and a very deep one with a lot of meaning. I believe, as many do, that Tu B'Shvat developed into what it is because Tu B'Shvat is a day that its only meaning had to do with the land of Israel. Tu B'Shvat has no halachic significance to those who live outside the land of Israel. The laws of Trumot and Ma'asrot, the laws of Shemitah, all the laws that have to be kept when it comes to vegetables, fruit growing in the land of Israel only apply, obviously, to the fruit and vegetables growing in the land of Israel. In Chutz La'aretz, you can go to any store, buy fruit and vegetables, and you don't have to ask if it's a Shemitah year, if it's Tumot Ma'asrot, where some part of the fruit given to the Kohen, to the Levi. No, you can eat it immediately. Hardly any laws to do with fruit and vegetables apply to fruit and vegetables that grow outside of Israel. In fact, I remember when I came to England many years ago, I was advised to shop in a shul in a store that I was told, don't worry, Rabbi, none of the fruit and vegetable here come from Israel. Guaranteed, they all come from outside of Israel. Therefore, there's no concern to buy the fruit from these vegetables. Don't buy from that grocer because that grocer supplies fruit and vegetables from Israel, which creates halachic questions. I found that very weird, if you ask me, but nevertheless, the fruit and vegetables growing in Eretz Yisrael have certain rules and laws that apply to them. And because of that, throughout the centuries, when the date Tu B'Shvat came up, people somehow associated the day with Israel, and they felt a pull to the land of Israel, and all the feelings and the emotions of one day returning to Zion, one day returning to the land of Israel came very real when Tu B'Shvat was around. And the custom, therefore, of eating the fruit and vegetables of Eretz Yisrael had to do with this idea that the fruit of Eretz Yisrael are special, are unique, are different. Now, I would like to, in today's short shiur, I would like to question, what does that really mean? That the fruit of Eretz Yisrael are special, unique. I'm holding here in front of me, I know this is a very bad joke, but I'm holding 2 apples here in front of me, okay? Now, this apple was grew in Eretz Yisrael. This apple is a Chutz La'aretz apple made in China. So this apple is different. And when this apple was picked from the tree, certain rules and laws apply to it. What does that mean? So in halacha, when we talk about mitzvot, halachot, that apply to fruit and vegetables, we talk about Kedusha. We speak about the concept of sanctity. Eretz Yisrael is special, unique, different. But there is a concept called Kedusha, sanctity, that we use very often in our tradition. Kadosh v'shimcha kadosh. We mention in our prayers many times that God is kadosh, God is holy. But in Judaism, we also understand that certain objects can have some Kedusha in them. What does that mean? What does that mean that this apple has Kedusha in it, if it would? Like, what does that mean? It's holy? Where do you see this holiness? So I want to explain something very, very important, very basic. Kedusha, first, before we talk about anything else about what Kedusha means, we must understand that Kedusha is a halachic term. I'm not going to go into mysticism and Kabbalah right now. I'm not trying to understand the philosophical and theological understanding what Kedusha, what sanctity means. For my shiur today, I would like to explain, I would like to understand that Kedusha is a halachic concept, meaning if an object has Kedusha, it means that certain rules apply to it. And let me explain, what does it mean really, Kedusha, sanctity? Sanctity always means separation, something that is separated from everything else. When we talk about Kedushat Eretz Yisrael, it means that Eretz Yisrael is separated from all other countries in the world. It's unique. It's different than any other country. Anything growing in Eretz Yisrael, therefore, has Kedusha. The apples growing in Eretz Yisrael are separate, are different than all apples growing elsewhere in the world. And the most important rule about Kedusha is the more something is holy, the more something has Kedusha in it, the more restrictions it has. When we talk about, for example, a shul being kadosh, what does that mean? That there's a Kedusha in a synagogue. That means that unlike other houses, unlike other institutions and buildings, the shul is separated and set aside from all other buildings. According to what we said, certain restrictions apply to the shul. In other houses and buildings, I can maybe run around and fool around and shout and yell and do what I want. In shul, you have to behave in a certain way. A house, for example, one is allowed to sell whenever they want to. A shul has restrictions. You can't just sell a shul. Sefer Torah. A Sefer Torah has Kedusha, which means that you can't just throw it in the garbage. You can't just throw it on the floor. It has certain restrictions. That's the rule of Kedusha. Kedusha has restrictions. It's separated. It's different. So, if it's true what I'm saying, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, has Kedusha, what we call Kedushat Eretz Yisrael, and this Kedusha creates restrictions on the fruit that grow in the land of Israel. It's the Kedusha of the land of Israel which restricts certain ways of how we eat the fruit, of what we have to do with the fruit. In the year of Shemitah, for example, we actually believe that there's something special about the fruit, which restricts the fruit that you can't throw them in the garbage. A fruit that grows on the 7th year, in the Shemitah year in Israel, cannot be thrown in the garbage. Even if you take a bite of the apple and you finish the apple and just have the core left, the core cannot be thrown in the garbage. You have to wrap it up. You have to put it in a plastic bag. You have to show. Yeah, it has kedusha. It has certain rules that apply to the fruit that grow in Eretz Yisrael. This same kedusha means that you have to give portions of these fruit to the Kohen, to the Levi, and to the poor. And that is a direct result of Kedushat Eretz Yisrael. Now, let's continue. So we understand what Kedusha is. We're arguing that Kedusha is a halachic concept. Kedusha creates restrictions. However, there's another rule about Kedusha. Kedusha is man-made. Kedusha is created by us, by people, by human beings. We make things kadosh. In other words, there is nothing in this world hardly anything in this world that comes down to this world with Kedusha. It is man who makes the Kedusha. Oh, if I had more time, I would talk about why Shabbat might be different, but normally and usually it's us, human beings, who make things Kedusha, Kadosh. We separate things, we put them on the side, and by doing that, we make them special, unique, right? I'm just throwing out in the air that when a man is Mekadesh a woman, we use the same, when a man marries a woman, we have the same idea of Kedusha. There's separation here, and which creates restrictions. But I'm not going to go, I'm going to go back to the world of fruit and vegetables and try to understand what does that mean, what I just said, for Eretz Yisrael. If Kedusha is created by us, what does that mean about Eretz Yisrael? It means that Eretz Yisrael became Kadosh when the Jews entered the land. And if you look at the Rambam, based upon the Talmud, explains that Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, became Kadosh, became holy, in the days of Yehoshua, when the Jews, after 40 years in the desert, entered the land of Israel, conquered the land of Israel, and thus the land became Kadosh. And from then on, all the fruit growing in Eretz Yisrael are now obligated to have Trumot Ma'asrot, Chala, Chadash, Shemitah, all the laws that apply to the fruit apply from then on. However, when the temple was destroyed, when our hold over the land of Israel was annulled, so was the Kedusha. For the next 70 years, from the year 586 BC, and for the next 70 years, there was no Kedusha in the land of Israel, which means in those 70 years, fruit that grow in Eretz Yisrael are not obligated to be kept the Shemitah or Trumot Ma'asrot. However, the Rambam explains, 70 years later, in the arrival of Ezra and Nehemiah, in the year approximately somewhere, let's say 516 BC, when the Jews came back, the Kedusha came back to the land of Israel, but it only came back to the places where Jews lived in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. So, for example, I'll share with you that there are some places till today in the land of Israel that do not have Kedusha. For example, the Jordan Valley area, we know for a fact that no Jews lived during the Second Temple era in the Jordan Valley. According to that, that would mean that in our days, fruit that grow in the Jordan Valley are very similar, if not the exact same, to fruit that are growing in Alaska. They don't have Kedusha, they don't have Kedusha. You can eat them without Trumot Ma'asrot. This, by the way, what I just said now is a very complicated matter when it comes to certain parts of Israel today that are questionable whether or not they have Kedusha. You might have heard of debates and questions regarding the southern part of Israel, like the Negev, Eilat, the Arava. All the southern part of Israel was not settled by Jews during the Second Temple era, which would suggest that these parts don't have the Kedusha, the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael. However, here we must ask a very important question. Until now, I spoke about the Kedusha, the holiness of the land of Israel, that creates halachic ramifications when it comes to Shemitah, Trumot Ma'asrot, Chala, Chadash, Orla. But there are other areas which Israel, the land of Israel, is special and unique. I'll give you a few examples. There's a mitzvah to make aliyah. Where to? The land of Israel. Another example. It says in some books that you can only receive prophecy in the land of Israel. Only in Israel, nowhere else. it's debatable what that means. I don't have time to go into that right now. It says in the Rambam that you can only receive proper rabbinical ordination. I'm talking about the classic original ordination that was given from Moshe Rabbeinu, passed on from generation to generation. You can only receive that in Israel. Now my question is the following. Does that mean that you cannot receive smicha in the Jordan Valley today? Does that mean that if you live in Eilat, you can't get prophecy? Let's say prophecy would be common. Does that mean that you can't receive prophecy in Eilat? Does that mean that Jews that live in Eilat are not fulfilling the mitzvah of living in Israel? Does the mitzvah of living in Israel only apply to areas of Israel that have halachic status of Kedushat Eretz Yisrael? The answer to that question is no. When we talk about the uniqueness of Eretz Yisrael, we must differentiate between the land of Israel itself and all what's special about the land to the halachic concept called Kedushat Eretz Yisrael. These are two separate areas. The land of Israel is special because God made the land of Israel his home. Because God tells us that he has a certain special relationship and connection to the land of Israel. Let's call it right now God's land. And because of that, certain rules only apply to the land of Israel. That makes no difference if there's Kedusha or no Kedusha. It doesn't make a difference if Jews are living here or Jews are not living here. Since the world was created, perhaps, or maybe from the days of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Eretz Yisrael has been chosen to be God's land. And therefore, it has always been a mitzvah to live in the land of God. Prophecy can only be received in God's land. Whether or not there's Kedusha, whether or not Jews live there, it makes no difference. However, there is another type of uniqueness of the land of Israel, and that has to do with the halachic concept of Kedusha. When it comes to the question of Kedusha, Kedusha is man-made. Kedusha is made by Jews coming to the land of Israel, living here, farming the land, occupying the land. When Jews come and live in Eretz Yisrael, the land becomes halachically kadosh. We separate it, we make it special, and as a result, the laws of Shemitah, Trumot and Ma'asrot, all those laws apply to those areas. So if we sum up what we said until now, I know it's a little bit complex, but if we sum up what we said until now, when we talk about Eretz Yisrael being kadosh, being special, being unique, we must differentiate between the land of Israel being special and unique because it's God's land, and all the ramifications that are derived from the land of Israel being God's land, to the halachic concept of Kedushat Eretz Yisrael, that is made by the fact that Jews live in Eretz Yisrael, farm the land, and live on the land. When we're not here, there is no Kedusha. When we are here, we bring the Kedusha on, and the Kedusha creates certain halach ramifications to things that grow in the land. If what I'm saying is true, and I hope it is, then Tu B'Shvat is more than just a cutoff date of deciding which fruit and vegetables have Kedusha in them. Because according to what we're saying, we understand that Tu B'Shvat is a day in which we recognize that by Jews living in the land of Israel, farming the land, governing the land, creating a sovereignty over the land, that unique combination of Jews living on the land of Israel is what creates Kedusha. That combination is what Kedusha is all about. Jews living in the land of Israel have the potential to create Kedusha. My father, Alav Shalom, used to talk about how when a Jew makes aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, if you think about it, every Jew is adding Kedusha to the land of Israel. Now, it sounds like a beautiful idea. Wow, you're adding Kedusha. But according to what I just said, it's halachic rule. Every Jew that comes here and makes the land more attached to the Jewish people is thus making that Kedusha, creating that Kedusha, which we said creates halachic ramifications. But by being in the land of Israel, we have that Kedushat Eretz Yisrael. Kadosh Baruch Hu, he has his powers of how he makes this land special and unique. But it's human beings that make the land special is what creates Tu B'Shvat. So Tu B'Shvat is a celebration in some way of Jews returning to the land of Israel, bringing Kedusha to the land, and we celebrate that Kedusha by applying certain rules and laws to the fruit that grow in Eretz Yisrael. I'll just end by explaining what I would like to do next week. Until now, I spoke about how Tu B'Shvat is a halachic celebration, has halachic ramifications. However, in modern days, Tu B'Shvat also became a day in which we associate the Medina, the state of Israel, as a young new state, because the first ever free elections to happen in 2,000 years happened in 1949 on Tu B'Shvat. Tu B'Shvat happened to be the first day that free elections occurred in the land after 2,000 years without having a home, without having a land, without having a state. The Jewish people went to vote a government, something that we like to do so much, that we seem to be doing it every few weeks here in this country. But if we forget the political issues that are going on right now, the fact that we are able to our freedom, our democracy, that to all of the new Jewish state. Bezrat Hashem, next week, we'll talk about the meaning of the elections that happened on Tu B'Shvat in 1940. Stay safe and stay healthy. Kol Tov.